Translate it if you can. The millionaire smirked. But as a janitor, I answered in perfect German. He said it with such cold amusement, as if daring me to fail. His crimson tie was tight around his neck, his eyes like knives cutting through me. Maybe you're finishing your rounds, checking the cameras, or closing the building while the world sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise, today's story will touch your heart. I'm Harold, and I never imagined my life would be defined by invisible labor in the shadows of Manhattan's gleaming towers. That morning started like any other, the sharp smell of industrial cleaner mixed with stale coffee, the hum of silence echoing through marble corridors designed for wealth. My threadbare gray uniform clung to me as I pushed the cleaning cart, its wheels scraping against polished floors that reflected lives I'd never live. I'd worked here, the corporate headquarters of Steinberg Holdings, a notorious investment firm, for over 12 years. And yet, my presence seemed as unnoticed as dust particles floating in expensive air. The elevator to the 42nd floor always made my knees ache. Arthritis had been my silent companion for years now, a reminder that 73 years of living had worn down more than just my patience. But the pension wasn't enough. Social Security barely covered rent in Queens. So here I was, mopping floors while millionaires discussed Bitcoin investments and stock market portfolios worth more than entire neighborhoods. That day, everything changed. Mr. Steinberg himself, a man whose net worth exceeded several small nations, handed me a folded note with that smirk. "Translate this if you can," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension reserved for people he considered beneath notice. Why pick me? Because I was the janitor who'd faded into the background so completely, they never guessed I'd once taught German literature at Columbia University before life's cruel mathematics forced me into this uniform. The irony burned like ammonia in my nostrils. 30 years ago, I'd stood before lecture halls full of eager students discussing Goethe and Rilke. Now, I stood before this empire builder, holding a document that would change everything. But they couldn't know. Not yet. To them, I was just another invisible soul trading dignity for survival. When I arrived in New York 45 years ago, fresh from Berlin with a wife and infant daughter, America promised everything. Emma's laugh filled our tiny apartment in Astoria. Sarah babbled her first words in both English and German. I believed intelligence and hard work would build the fortune I dreamed of, not millions, just enough to send Sarah to college, to give Emma the life she deserved. Instead, academic positions disappeared like morning mist. Budget cuts eliminated tenure tracks. The university that had welcomed my dissertation suddenly had no room for foreign professors with thick accents, so I cleaned their buildings instead. 20 years of watching other men discuss investments while I emptied their trash. 20 years of listening to stock market victories while I calculated whether I could afford both heating oil and Sarah's textbooks. The cruel mathematics never balanced. Every dollar saved for her education meant another day of cold coffee and generic cereal for breakfast. Emma tried to understand. She took on extra shifts at the diner, her hands cracking from constant dish soap, her smile growing thinner each month we couldn't quite reach the middle class. "It's temporary," I'd whisper, holding her close after particularly brutal days when investment bankers treated me like furniture. But temporary stretched into decades, and promises became prayers whispered to an empty apartment after Emma's heart gave out during Sarah's junior year. The funeral director spoke of tragedy striking good people. I paid for her casket with money I'd saved for our anniversary trip to Berlin. Sarah held my hand during the service, but I felt her slipping away too, not into death, but into a life where her father's broken dreams wouldn't drag her down. She graduated, moved to California, called less frequently. Success meant escaping what I'd become. That left me with this uniform, these keys, these endless nights walking empty corridors where my footsteps echoed like accusations. The building's security cameras recorded my movements, but never my humanity. I was data. Harold, night janitor, employee ID 4471, payroll deduction for health insurance I couldn't afford to use. Do you know that feeling? When your own children love you but can't quite look at you the same way. When Sunday phone calls become monthly check-ins filled with careful politeness. Sarah's shame wasn't cruel. It was protective. Easier to tell friends her father was retired than explain he mopped floors past midnight to supplement inadequate retirement savings. The Millionaire's test felt like cosmic justice delivered through paper and ink. That German document contained details of their cryptocurrency holdings, offshore accounts worth hundreds of millions in Bitcoin and Ethereum. Technical specifications for wealth management that would make most translators struggle. But I read it like bedtime poetry, each financial term as familiar as my own name. The richest man in the building had just handed his secrets to the poorest employee, betting on my ignorance. His smirk widened as he waited, probably expecting stammered confusion or apologetic silence. Instead, I cleared my throat and began. This document outlines the transfer of digital assets valued at $230 million, including cryptocurrency portfolios and offshore investments structured to minimize tax obligations. His face went pale. The crimson tie suddenly looked like a noose. "Where did you learn German?" he demanded, voice sharp with surprise and something else. Fear? I met his eyes for the first time in 12 years. "Columbia University," I said quietly, before I learned to disappear. The next weeks brought subtle changes. Whispered conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Important documents vanished from trash cans before I could empty them. They'd finally noticed the janitor, but for all the wrong reasons. I'd become dangerous, not because I was threatening, but because I'd shattered their comfortable assumptions about invisible people. But silence breeds more secrets than speech. My night access meant witnessing things wealth tries to hide. Board meetings held after hours, discussing investment strategies that skirted legal boundaries. Shredded documents partially reconstructed by careful hands. Phone calls about moving assets to untraceable Bitcoin wallets. They treated me like furniture while planning financial maneuvers that would make headlines if exposed. Sarah called that month for the first time in 6 weeks. Her voice carried new warmth, probably guilt from missing my birthday again. "How's work, Dad?" she asked, and I almost told her everything. About the documents, the secrets, the power shifts happening around kitchen carts and floor buffers. Instead, I said, "Same as always. Sweetheart, just earning my keep." But earning had taken new meaning. The Millionaire's test hadn't just revealed my language skills. It had exposed the vast underestimation wealthy people apply to working souls. They build fortunes by exploiting gaps in understanding, then assume everyone else lacks the intelligence to comprehend their methods. Steinberg's smirk had cost him more than pride. It had given me leverage. The building's other employees began looking at me differently too. Maria, the overnight security guard, shared knowing glances when important visitors left management meetings looking worried. Jerome, who delivered documents after midnight, mentioned unusual shredding activities. We formed an unlikely alliance, 3 night shift workers suddenly seeing patterns in the wealthy's panic. But I wasn't seeking revenge. Anger had died with Emma, buried under years of accepting circumstances I couldn't change. What I felt was something quieter, but more powerful, the recognition of worth postponed, not lost. The German documents had reminded me that intelligence doesn't disappear just because employment circumstances force compromise. I'd spent decades believing I'd failed Emma and Sarah by becoming invisible. Now I realized I'd simply been preparing for a moment when invisibility became advantage. The second test came 3 weeks later. Steinberg approached me near the executive washroom, another document in hand. This time his manner was different. Respectful, almost pleading. "Harold," he said, using my name for the first time ever, "I need your help with something confidential." The paper contained complex financial projections in German, outlining investment strategies worth billions. He wasn't testing my ability anymore. He was acknowledging it. But power shifts require careful navigation. I translated his document perfectly, thoroughly, without emotion. Then I said, "Mr. Steinberg, I've been thinking about our conversation. Perhaps we should discuss my consulting fee." His eyebrows lifted. The janitor was negotiating. "What did you have in mind?" he asked carefully. I named a figure that would have seemed modest to him but represented 3 months of my regular salary. He agreed immediately. That arrangement continued for months. Late-night translations, private consultations about German business partners, discreet advice about European cryptocurrency regulations. My steady paycheck supplemented by fees that slowly accumulated into something resembling financial stability. Not wealth. I'd never joined their circles of privilege. But security Emma and I had dreamed about during those cold years, sacrificing comfort for Sarah's future. The real transformation wasn't financial, though money certainly helped. It was the recovery of professional dignity I'd buried under years of service industry humiliation. Speaking German again, analyzing complex documents, offering expertise that commanded respect, these activities reminded me who I'd been before necessity redefined identity. The janitor's uniform still hung in my locker, but it no longer felt like a prison sentence. Winter brought unexpected complications. Sarah called with news. She'd lost her job in Silicon Valley as the tech industry contracted. Her savings wouldn't last long with California's cost of living. For the first time in years, she asked for help, not just emotional support, but actual financial assistance until she could relocate somewhere more affordable. The daughter who'd been embarrassed by my circumstances was reaching out to the father, whose circumstances had quietly improved. I transferred money that month without the familiar anxiety of choosing between necessities. $3,000, more than I'd ever been able to send her before. When she called to confirm the deposit, her voice carried surprise and something else. "Dad, where did this come from? Are you okay?" I smiled alone in my Queens apartment. "Consulting work," I said truthfully. "Some people finally realized what I'm worth." But Steinberg's business faced regulatory scrutiny that winter. European authorities were investigating cryptocurrency transfers, demanding documentation that required precise translation. My midnight consulting sessions became urgent crisis management. Documents arrived with increasing frequency, each carrying higher stakes than the last. The millionaire who'd smirked at my intelligence now depended on it to protect assets worth hundreds of millions. One February night, he approached me with an offer I hadn't expected. "Harold, I want to hire you permanently as my European liaison. Full-time position, benefits, office on the 38th floor." The salary he mentioned was 4 times my cleaning wages. I could afford to retire from night shifts, perhaps even visit Berlin again after 4 decades. "What would be my title?" I asked. "Senior International Consultant," he replied without hesitation. The invisible janitor was being offered visibility, respect, professional resurrection, but accepting meant joining the world that had dismissed me for decades, working among people who'd walked past me for 12 years without acknowledgement, pretending our relationship had always been collegial. I'd become one of them, not through birth or luck, but through talent finally recognized because it had become necessary. I asked for time to consider. That weekend, I walked through Central Park thinking about Emma's dreams, Sarah's pride, and my own definition of success. The consulting fees had already changed our possibilities. Sarah was planning to move back to New York, to be closer now that distance felt like choice rather than escape. My apartment had heat that winter, real coffee instead of generic brands. Small luxuries that had once seemed impossible. The decision came during a late-night conversation with myself in Emma's favorite spot by the reservoir. She'd wanted me to be happy more than rich, fulfilled more than famous. Teaching had satisfied that desire, but circumstances had twisted ambition into survival. Now I had options. continue building a consulting practice independently, or accept corporate integration into wealth that had never welcomed working people like us. I declined Steinberg's offer, but proposed an alternative, an independent consulting contract that would allow me to work with multiple clients, set my own hours, maintain control over which projects aligned with my values. No office politics, no pretending past dismissals hadn't occurred. Just professional expertise exchanged for fair compensation, mutual respect acknowledged through clear boundaries. He agreed reluctantly. Wealthy people prefer to own rather than hire. But my translations had become essential to protecting assets that regulatory authorities were scrutinizing. Independence was inconvenient for him, liberating for me. I could help when needed, refuse when uncomfortable, charge appropriately for skills that had never lost value despite years of being ignored. Spring brought changes that felt like rebirth rather than employment transition. Sarah returned to New York, taking a Manhattan apartment I helped secure with those accumulated consulting fees. Our Sunday dinners resumed, with easy conversation replacing polite distance. She was proud of my professional resurrection, fascinated by stories of millionaire clients, suddenly recognizing intelligence they had overlooked. "Why didn't you tell us about your language skills?" she asked during one of those reunions. I considered various answers: pride, resignation, protective silence. Finally, I said, "Sometimes we hide our talents when the world doesn't seem ready for them, but they don't disappear. They just wait for the right moment." She nodded with understanding that came from her own years of professional struggle in competitive industries. The cleaning company offered me a day shift supervisor position that summer, managing other janitors with respect they'd never shown me during night rounds. I declined politely. Those hallways held too many memories of humiliation postponed, dignity temporarily surrendered for survival's sake. My consulting practice had grown enough to support independence from work that had sustained but never satisfied me. Instead, I rented a small office in Midtown, nothing fancy, but professional space where clients could meet the European language consultant without crossing paths with memories of service industry invisibility. My first business cards felt revolutionary. Harold Steinman, independent linguistic consultant, German, English, European financial documentation. The name on those cards commanded respect that uniforms had obscured. Do you understand how powerful such transformation feels? When the world finally acknowledges abilities you've carried quietly through years of being overlooked? When financial stability arrives through talent rather than endurance? It's not wealth in any conventional sense. I'll never own penthouses or discuss stock market portfolios worth millions. But it's security Emma would recognize. Success Sarah could celebrate without embarrassment. The building still employs me occasionally for complex projects that require discretion and expertise. But I enter through the main lobby now, wearing suits Emma would have admired, carrying myself with confidence that years of night shifts couldn't extinguish. Former colleagues nod respectfully. Security guards who once barely acknowledged my existence now greet me by name. Steinberg himself maintains wary professionalism during our consultations. He probably prefers our original dynamic, wealthy employer, invisible employee, but circumstances have redefined our relationship. He needs my skills more than I need his approval. That shift in leverage represents decades of deferred recognition suddenly acknowledged by necessity. But the deepest satisfaction isn't financial or professional. It's the recovery of identity that had never disappeared, only hibernated during harsh seasons when survival overshadowed self-expression. I'm teaching again, not at universities, but through community programs for elderly immigrants whose talents have been overlooked by employment systems that prioritize youth over experience. We gather Tuesday evenings in a Queens library, sharing stories of intelligence dismissed, skills undervalued, worth finally recognized. Sarah visits those sessions sometimes, watching her father help others find their voices after years of silence. I think she's proud of both versions of me, the janitor who sacrificed everything for her education and the consultant who recovered dignity without abandoning compassion. We're building new memories now, ones that honor past struggle while celebrating present possibilities. Winter returned with consulting contracts that would have seemed impossible during those early years, mopping floors while millionaires discussed wealth I could never imagine. European clients seeking American market entry, American companies expanding into German-speaking countries, immigration attorneys needing precise document translation for elderly clients whose stories resembled my own. Each project represents not just income, but validation of expertise that had been waiting for recognition. The Christmas card from Steinberg Holdings arrived with genuine warmth, unusual for a man who'd once smirked at my supposed limitations. "Thank you for your invaluable assistance this year," it read. "Your expertise has been essential to our success." I smiled reading those words, thinking of Emma's belief that intelligence eventually finds its proper recognition. She'd been right about patience, wrong about timing. Sometimes transformation takes decades, but perhaps that delay served its purpose. Younger me might have used such opportunities for advancement rather than service. The years of invisibility taught lessons about dignity maintained despite circumstances, compassion preserved through hardship, humility that makes success meaningful rather than merely profitable. I understand now why Emma loved the man who cleaned floors more than she might have loved the one who'd immediately climbed corporate ladders. Spring brought an invitation I hadn't expected. Columbia University's Alumni Association wanted me to speak about maintaining professional identity through career transitions. Sarah encouraged me to accept. "Tell them about keeping your dreams alive when survival overshadows ambition," she suggested. The lecture hall would be the same one where I'd taught literature decades earlier, but my audience would be different. Current students facing their own uncertain futures. Standing before those young faces, I shared lessons learned through years of being overlooked before being acknowledged, about intelligence that doesn't diminish with employment circumstances, about dignity maintained through compromise without cynicism, about the dignity of all honest work. Whether teaching Goethe or mopping floors or translating documents for millionaires who've finally learned to recognize value in unexpected places. The question and answer session lasted longer than my presentation. Students wanted to understand how someone rebuilds professional identity after decades of invisibility. I told them about patience without passivity, about maintaining skills during seasons when they're unrecognized, about being ready when opportunity finally arrives wearing different clothes than we'd expected. One young woman asked the question that mattered most. "Do you regret those years when your education wasn't valued?" I considered her young face, probably the age Sarah had been when I'd switched from professor to janitor, and gave her the truth. "Those years taught me that worth isn't determined by wealth or recognition. They prepared me for appreciating dignity when it returns, and they connected me to immigration communities who need advocates more than academia needs another professor." The applause was polite but warm. Several students approached afterward with their own stories of family members who'd sacrificed professional ambitions for survival, whose intelligence had been overlooked but never lost. We exchanged contact information, another small consulting opportunity, another chance to help names buried in service industries find their proper recognition. Driving home through Queens that evening, I passed the building where I'd mopped floors for 12 years. The windows glowed with expensive light, illuminated offices where millionaires made decisions affecting thousands of lives. I felt no bitterness, no envy, no regret. Those years had been necessary, not just for survival, but for understanding the dignity that survives when everything else gets stripped away. My apartment holds artifacts from both lives now. Emma's photograph sits beside my consulting contracts. My old cleaning uniform hangs next to suits I wear for client meetings. Academic books in German share shelf space with financial documents I've translated for companies whose stock market success depends partly on my expertise. These aren't contradictions. They're integration of a life that's included both service and recognition, survival and success. The phone rings often now with requests for assistance. Elderly immigrants need document translation for naturalization ceremonies. Investment firms require expertise in European cryptocurrency regulations. Community organizations want speakers who understand maintaining dignity through decades of being overlooked. Each call represents another opportunity to transform past invisibility into present purpose. But the most important call came last month from Sarah. "Dad, I'm pregnant," she announced, voice bright with excitement and anxiety. "Will you help me raise this baby?" Of course, I said yes, but this time from a position of security rather than desperation. This grandchild will know a grandfather whose worth is recognized, whose intelligence is valued, whose story includes both suffering and resurrection. As I prepare for this new chapter, I think often about the millionaire's smirk that started everything. His test was meant to embarrass, to confirm his assumptions about invisible people. Instead, it revealed the dangerous underestimation that wealthy people apply to working souls. He thought he was showing superior intelligence. Instead, he demonstrated the blindness that comes from never having to see past surface appearances. The German document he handed me contained more than financial information. It held years of accumulated wisdom about human worth, about talent that survives dismissal, about the revolutionary power of recognition arriving precisely when it's most needed. His challenge gave me permission to stop hiding abilities that had never disappeared, only waited for their proper moment. Walking through Manhattan now, I see others like I once was, elderly workers whose presence seems invisible, but whose stories probably contain surprises that would astonish employers who've never bothered to look beyond uniforms and accents. The woman cleaning office buildings might hold advanced degrees from schools their executives couldn't enter. The man emptying trash could translate documents they couldn't comprehend. We're everywhere, we invisible intellectuals, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. But waiting isn't passive anymore. The Tuesday evening classes continue, helping other immigrants find their voices after decades of silence. Sarah's pregnancy announcement has inspired me to create something more permanent, a consulting cooperative where multilingual seniors can share expertise while supporting each other through career transitions. We'll call it Bridge Builders, because that's what we are, connecting cultures and generations and possibilities that seemed lost, but were only sleeping. Do you know someone whose abilities have been overlooked? Have you felt the sting of being underestimated simply because circumstances forced you into work that didn't reflect your true capabilities? The millionaire learned that intelligence wears work uniforms as often as business suits. More importantly, he discovered that respect withheld eventually comes due, with interest compounding like his precious cryptocurrency investments. My story isn't about revenge against wealth or shame about honest work. It's about the quiet victory that comes from refusing to disappear completely, even when the world encourages invisibility. Those years mopping floors taught me that dignity survives dismissal, that knowledge accumulates regardless of recognition, and that the right moment for resurrection always arrives, usually when least expected, always when most needed. The Bridge Builders Cooperative officially launched 6 months after Sarah's announcement. Our first meeting drew 12 elderly immigrants, each carrying decades of professional experience dismissed by employers who saw only accents and age. Margaret had been a nuclear physicist in Poland before cleaning laboratories in New Jersey. Antonio once conducted symphonies in Argentina before becoming a restaurant dishwasher in Brooklyn. Elena had taught French literature before accepting night shifts at hospital laundries. We met in the same Queens Library where I'd been teaching evening classes, but now with official nonprofit status and seed funding from consulting fees I'd accumulated through Steinberg's reluctant respect. The irony wasn't lost on me, using profits from translating wealth management documents to fund opportunity for people wealth management had overlooked. Emma would have appreciated such poetic justice. Our business model was simple: combine expertise, share resources, negotiate collectively. Instead of individual immigrants approaching translation agencies with hesitant offers, we presented ourselves as a consortium of multilingual professionals with verified credentials. Margaret handled technical documents in Polish and Russian. Antonio specialized in legal translations from Spanish. Elena managed French business correspondence. I coordinated German financial materials. The difference in respect was immediate. Agencies that had previously offered insultingly low rates suddenly negotiated professional fees when confronted with organized expertise. Law firms needing immigration document translation discovered they could access doctoral-level precision at competitive prices. Investment companies found native speakers who understood both languages and financial terminology. But the transformation went beyond economics. Margaret stood straighter during client meetings, her voice regaining confidence that decades of janitorial work had dimmed. Antonio spoke about music again, comparing linguistic rhythm to orchestral phrasing. Elena quoted Proust during translation discussions, her intellectual curiosity reviving after years of industrial silence. Sarah visited one of our monthly meetings during her 7th month of pregnancy, watching her father coordinate between accomplished professionals who'd been treated as invisible servants. "This is beautiful," she whispered as Margaret explained quantum physics terminology to Elena, who was translating nuclear research papers for French clients. "You're all becoming yourselves again." Exactly. That's what bridge builders provided: permission to become ourselves again. Not new selves, transformed selves, or improved selves, just the selves we'd always been, temporarily buried under employment circumstances that confused survival with identity. The cooperative's success attracted attention from immigrant advocacy organizations. The New York City Department of Aging invited us to present our model at a citywide conference on senior employment. The Commissioner of Small Business Development wanted to understand how overlooked human capital could be mobilized for economic benefit. Academic researchers requested interviews about professional identity resilience, but media attention brought unexpected complications. A journalist from the Wall Street Journal wanted to write about hidden PhDs in service industries, focusing particularly on my story as the janitor who'd become millionaire consultant. The article would highlight America's waste of immigrant expertise, the dignity of all honest work, the power of recognition properly applied. I agreed to the interview, despite worries about privacy and reputation. Sarah encouraged the publicity. "Other people need to hear your story, Dad. Other families are living what we lived." She was right. Invisibility helps no one, while visibility might help everyone facing similar circumstances. The journalist, Robert Chen, arrived at my Midtown office with genuine curiosity rather than sensationalist assumptions. He'd researched my academic background, Steinberg Holdings' regulatory challenges, the cooperative's nonprofit structure. His questions were thoughtful, respectful, focused on systemic issues rather than individual drama. "How many people like you are cleaning buildings right now?" he asked. "People with advanced degrees, professional experience, multilingual abilities." I considered the security guards, housekeepers, maintenance workers I'd known during 12 years of invisible labor. "Thousands," I replied honestly. "Maybe tens of thousands just in Manhattan. We're everywhere. We PhD janitors and master's degree dishwashers and multilingual taxi drivers. The employment system just doesn't know how to see us." The article appeared 3 weeks later under the headline, "The Invisible Intellectuals: How America Wastes Its Most Experienced Workers." My photograph showed a gray-haired man in a business suit sitting in an office lined with German literature and financial documents. The caption read, "Harold Steinman, 74, spent 12 years mopping floors for millionaires before they discovered he could translate their most critical documents." Reader response overwhelmed both the newspaper and my answering machine. Elderly immigrants from across the country called with their own stories of professional dismissal and survival through service work. Employment agencies inquired about accessing our translation cooperative. University career counselors wanted guidance about helping older students navigate age discrimination. But the most meaningful response came from former colleagues at Columbia, professors who remembered my literature classes from 30 years earlier. "Harold, we had no idea," one department chair admitted during a phone call that reduced me to grateful tears. "You disappeared so completely. We thought you'd return to Germany." Academia's assumption about my departure revealed how easily intelligent people become truly invisible when circumstances force career transitions. The publicity also brought advanced consulting opportunities that my years of invisibility had prepared me to handle discreetly. International law firms needed German contract analysis for European cryptocurrency companies. Immigration attorneys required document translation for clients whose professional credentials had been dismissed by American employers. Financial institutions sought expertise in European regulatory compliance. Each new project reinforced lessons learned during decades of being overlooked. Intelligence accumulates regardless of recognition, expertise deepens through diverse experience, and wisdom comes from understanding both sides of complex systems. The janitor who'd watched millionaires manage wealth understood their vulnerabilities better than colleagues who'd never faced financial desperation. Sarah gave birth to our granddaughter on a snow-bright February morning, exactly 1 year after Steinberg's employment offer that I'd declined in favor of independence. Emma Rose arrived weighing 7 pounds and 4 ounces, named for the grandmother she'd never meet, and the flower Emma had planted in every apartment window box we'd ever owned. Holding her in the hospital room, surrounded by Sarah's grateful exhaustion and my own overwhelming joy, I thought about the legacy this tiny person would inherit. Not wealth in any conventional sense. I'd never accumulate millions like the clients I served, but security, dignity, and example of intelligence valued regardless of employment circumstances. "Tell me about her great-grandmother," Sarah requested, adjusting Emma Rose's blanket with hands that looked exactly like her mother's had during similar moments decades earlier. So I shared stories about Emma's courage during our early years in America, her faith in eventual recognition, her belief that dignity survives any circumstances when maintained through love rather than bitterness. The baby slept through my gentle recitations of German lullabies Emma had sung to Sarah, songs that connected 3 generations of women across decades and oceans and economic circumstances. This granddaughter would grow up bilingual, bicultural, aware from birth that intelligence comes in many forms and deserves recognition regardless of the uniforms it sometimes wears. Spring brought the cooperative's first annual report, documenting our collective success in ways that individual struggle had never achieved. 12 founding members had grown to 37 multilingual professionals. Translation revenue had exceeded projections by 40%. More importantly, member satisfaction surveys revealed restored professional confidence, renewed intellectual engagement, and hope for futures that honored past education rather than dismissing it. Margaret was teaching physics workshops for immigrant children whose parents worked night shifts. Antonio had formed a community orchestra that performed at retirement homes and immigrant cultural centers. Elena was developing French-language curricula for adult education programs. Each member was finding ways to contribute expertise while earning respect that employment discrimination had withheld. But success brought new challenges. Several members received job offers from corporations that had discovered their abilities through cooperative projects. Margaret was invited to consult for a renewable energy company. Antonio received proposals from music therapy organizations. Elena was recruited by international schools, needing experienced French instructors. These opportunities represented individual advancement that cooperative membership had enabled. But success also threatened group cohesion if members departed for better personal circumstances. We needed to evolve from survival necessity into sustainable professional development that could accommodate varying levels of individual achievement. The solution came from Margaret's physics background, modeling the cooperative like atomic structure with stable core membership and rotating outer electrons representing members who moved between cooperative work and individual opportunities. People could maintain connection while pursuing advancement, contributing expertise and reputation while accessing support and referrals. This flexible structure attracted new members who were already employed but wanted professional community with others who understood the immigrant experience of underemployment. A Russian engineer working as a taxi driver joined for evening translation projects. A Peruvian architect cleaning office buildings contributed to construction document translation. A Chinese mathematician teaching elementary school handled technical translations during weekends. The diversity of experience strengthened our collective expertise while providing mutual support that individual advancement couldn't offer. We became more than a business cooperative. We were a professional family that understood the complex navigation required when intelligence must constantly prove itself worthy of recognition. Sarah returned to work when Emma Rose was 3 months old, confident that her father's transformed circumstances provided family stability that her own childhood had lacked. She'd accepted a position with a nonprofit organization focused on immigrant services, partly inspired by witnessing the cooperative's impact on overlooked professional communities. "You've shown me that giving up isn't the same as starting over," she told me during one of our regular Sunday dinners, now held in her Manhattan apartment rather than my Queens efficiency. Emma Rose slept in a bassinet beside the table while we discussed career transitions, family legacies, and the ways individual transformation can create community change. I was proud that her professional choice reflected values we'd maintained through decades of economic struggle. Working with immigrant families, helping navigate systems that often overlook human potential, advocating for recognition of abilities that survive employment discrimination, her career would serve communities like the ones that had sustained us during invisible years. But I also recognized how my transformation had enabled Sarah's choices. She could afford to work for lower nonprofit wages because she no longer worried about supporting her father's retirement. She could take professional risks because family financial stability no longer required her individual economic success. My late-life career resurrection had liberated her from burdens that economic desperation places on adult children. The Wall Street Journal article's 1-year anniversary brought follow-up interviews about sustainable change versus temporary inspiration. Robert Chen wanted to understand whether individual success stories could create systemic improvement, whether one janitor's professional resurrection could benefit the thousands of others still mopping floors while holding advanced degrees. The question challenged me to think beyond personal victory toward institutional change. Bridge builders had proven that overlooked immigrants possessed valuable expertise, but success required clients sophisticated enough to recognize quality regardless of accents and ages. It demanded customers willing to pay professional fees for professional work. Most importantly, it needed cooperation between people who'd been taught to compete for scarce recognition. My answer emphasized replication over individual celebrity. The story isn't about one successful janitor, I explained to Chen during our follow-up interview. It's about systems that create thousands of unsuccessful janitors with PhD capabilities. Change means building structures that recognize human capital rather than wasting it because of accent discrimination or age bias. The second article focused more on policy implications than personal narrative. How should employment agencies evaluate immigrant credentials? What training could help employers recognize multilingual abilities as business assets? Which government programs could support professional cooperatives serving underemployed populations? But policy discussions felt abstract compared to daily phone calls from individuals whose stories resembled my own decades of invisibility. A Romanian engineer cleaning hotel rooms wanted guidance about showcase technical expertise. A Polish nurse working as a home health aide needed help organizing professional credentials for American medical licensing. A Salvadoran teacher driving for a ride-sharing service was seeking translation opportunities that could supplement driving income. Each caller represented human potential, dismissed by employment systems that prioritize convenience over capability. I couldn't help everyone individually, but bridge builders could provide models for professional organization that others might replicate in different cities, different industries, different communities facing similar challenges of recognition and respect. The cooperative's second year brought expansion requests from immigrant communities in Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago. Organizers wanted guidance about establishing translation collectives, identifying members with professional backgrounds, negotiating with clients who'd previously exploited individual vulnerability through impossibly low fees and disrespectful treatment. Sarah suggested that expansion consulting could become my primary focus, using bridge builders' success to help other communities organize their overlooked human capital. "You figured out how to make invisibility visible," she observed during one of our planning conversations. Emma Rose gurgled agreement from her high chair while attempting to eat pureed sweet potatoes. "That's a skill other people need." The suggestion excited me more than individual translation projects, lucrative though they'd become. Teaching had always been my deepest professional satisfaction, whether discussing German literature with Columbia students, translating financial documents for Millionaire clients, or helping immigrant communities organize collective expertise. Expansion consulting would combine all these elements: education, languages, community development, and economic empowerment. But expansion also meant traveling, spending time away from the granddaughter whose presence had become central to my daily happiness. Emma Rose was walking now, babbling in what sounded like German pronunciation mixed with English vocabulary. She recognized my voice, reached for my reading glasses, fell asleep most peacefully in my arms. How could I balance professional opportunity with grandparental devotion? The answer came from Sarah's practical wisdom. "Take us with you, Dad. Emma and I can travel while you're consulting. She should see different cities, meet different immigrant communities, understand from childhood that America includes people like us who had to work twice as hard to get half the recognition." So began our family consulting practice. Sarah handled logistics and community outreach while I focused on professional development and business organization. Emma Rose charmed everyone she met while providing visible evidence that professional resurrection could benefit multiple generations. We became a mobile demonstration of immigrant success that honored working-class dignity while achieving middle-class security. Philadelphia's immigrant community had organized around restaurant workers who possessed diverse professional backgrounds. The Romanian engineer I'd spoken with had connected a Polish nurse, a Salvadoran teacher, and a dozen other professionals who were working in food service while seeking better opportunities. They needed guidance about cooperative structure, client development, and marketing professional services despite limited English fluency. Boston's organizers focused on older immigrants who'd been forced into early retirement when their professional credentials weren't recognized. A Chinese physician was driving for a taxi company. A Russian scientist was working as a home health aide. A Mexican architect was cleaning office buildings. They possessed decades of experience but needed support to market expertise collectively rather than competing individually for scarce opportunities. Chicago's group included immigrants who'd been teachers, nurses, engineers, and accountants in their countries of origin, but were working as janitors, dishwashers, and retail clerks in America. They wanted to establish a professional translation and consulting cooperative that could serve the city's diverse business community while providing dignified employment for overlooked human capital. Each consulting engagement taught me something new about the breadth of immigrant expertise that American employment systems routinely waste. Every city contained hundreds of professionals who'd been reduced to service work not because they lacked ability, but because they lacked recognition. Our work wasn't creating talent, it was organizing talent that had always existed, but remained invisible to employers who couldn't see past accents and ages. The travel also deepened my relationship with Emma Rose, who adapted easily to hotel rooms and conference centers and community meetings where adults spoke multiple languages while she played with toys that represented different cultural traditions. She was learning through immersion that intelligence comes in many forms, that respect can be earned regardless of employment circumstances, and that family means supporting each other through both struggle and success. Sarah documented our travels through photographs and journal entries that captured the human side of immigrant professional development. Pictures of Emma Rose sleeping in my arms during cooperative meetings. Images of former engineers teaching translation workshops. Portraits of overlooked experts who discovered their voices through collective organization and mutual support. "This could be a book," she suggested during our flight home from Chicago. "Not just your story, but everyone's story. The invisible intellectuals in America's service economy." The idea intrigued me, using individual narrative to illuminate systemic issues, personal transformation to advocate for policy change, family legacy to inspire others facing similar challenges. But writing required time I was spending on consulting and translation work that supported both our family and the cooperative's continued operation. Success had brought welcome complications, more opportunities than time, more requests than capacity, more potential impact than individual energy could sustain. The solution emerged during a conversation with Margaret, who'd become Bridge Builder's de facto president while I traveled to establish sister cooperatives. "Harold, you've taught us to organize ourselves," she observed during one of our monthly meetings in the Queen's Library. "Maybe it's time for us to teach others while you focus on documenting what we've learned." She was right. The cooperative had grown beyond needing my daily oversight. Members were handling client relations, quality control, financial management, and new member recruitment. They'd internalized lessons about professional dignity, collective bargaining, and community support that could function independently of my leadership. This transition allowed me to focus on writing the book Sarah had suggested, using evening hours and weekend time to chronicle not just my transformation from invisible janitor to respected consultant, but the broader story of immigrant intelligence that America's employment systems routinely overlook and occasionally discover. The writing process meant revisiting memories I'd buried during decades of survival focus. Emma's death, Sarah's distance, the humiliation of being treated as furniture while possessing expertise that could solve the problems wealthy people discussed. But it also meant celebrating resurrection, recognition, and the quiet satisfaction of proving that dignity survives dismissal when maintained through love rather than bitterness. Emma Rose provided perfect writing companions, babbling contentedly in her playpen while I typed stories about her great-grandmother, her mother's childhood, and the grandfather who'd learned to become invisible until invisibility became advantage. She was growing up trilingual, English from Sarah, German from me, and Spanish from the cooperative members who'd become extended family. The manuscript grew slowly but steadily, expanding beyond personal narrative to include policy analysis about immigrant employment, interviews with other professionals who'd experienced similar transformations, and practical guidance for communities wanting to organize overlooked human capital. Sarah edited chapters during Emma Rose's afternoon naps, her nonprofit experience helping me balance individual stories with systemic analysis. "Don't let policy discussion overwhelm the human element," she advised. "People need to feel these stories, not just understand the statistics." By Emma Rose's first birthday, the manuscript was approaching completion. 300 pages documenting the journey from invisible janitor to recognized consultant, from individual struggle to community organization, from personal transformation to professional legacy. The story belonged to more than just me. It represented thousands of immigrants whose abilities had been dismissed until circumstances forced recognition. The birthday party celebrated more than Emma Rose's first year. It marked the second anniversary of my translation breakthrough, the first anniversary of Bridge Builder's founding, and the completion of work that might help other overlooked professionals find their voices. Margaret brought Polish pastries, Antonio performed Spanish lullabies, Elena contributed French children's books. The party reflected the multicultural community that professional cooperation had created, but the deepest satisfaction came from watching Emma Rose interact with adults who'd become family through shared experience of being underestimated and occasionally acknowledged. She would grow up knowing that intelligence wears many uniforms, that respect can be earned regardless of circumstances, and that family includes everyone who supports your journey toward becoming your best self. As evening approached and guests departed with promises to continue our work together, I held my granddaughter while Sarah cleaned celebration dishes and prepared for another week of immigrant advocacy work that my professional resurrection had enabled her to pursue. The book would be published eventually, the consulting practice would continue expanding, and bridge builders would establish new chapters in additional cities. But the moment that mattered was holding Emma Rose while she fell asleep to the sound of her mother speaking on the phone with community organizations that needed translation services our cooperative could provide. This was legacy. Not wealth in any conventional sense, but security that allowed multiple generations to choose meaningful work rather than merely survive economic circumstances. Emma Rose would know her worth regardless of others' ability to recognize it, maintaining dignity through any challenges while remaining ready for opportunities that could transform individual circumstances into community benefit. Looking back at the millionaire's smirk that had started everything, I realized his test had given me more than professional recognition. It had provided permission to stop hiding abilities I'd maintained through decades of invisibility. More importantly, it had revealed that respect withheld eventually comes due. With interest compounding like the cryptocurrency investments, I now translated for clients who'd finally learned to see past uniform assumptions. The story continues through Emma Rose's multilingual babbling, Sarah's advocacy work, Margaret's physics workshops, Antonio's community orchestra, and Elena's adult education programs. We are the invisible intellectuals who became visible through organization, recognition, and the revolutionary power of refusing to disappear completely. To everyone who's ever felt invisible in their workplace, overlooked despite their intelligence, dismissed because of their circumstances, remember this: your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. Keep your talents sharp, your dignity intact, and your eyes open for the moment when someone finally asks the right question. That moment will come. And when it does, you'll be ready with an answer that transforms everything. What about you? Have you experienced something similar, or do you know someone whose true abilities were hidden behind uniform assumptions? Share your story in the comments below. If this touched your heart, please like and subscribe. It helps these messages reach others who work with dedication behind the scenes. For more stories that celebrate the dignity of working people, check out our special podcast by clicking the link on the left. Thank you for joining me on this journey of recognition. I'll see you in the next story.